Destructive wildfires have become all too commonplace in recent years. The harrowing tales and the devastating images emerging from Southern California are just the latest in a growing list of examples. Of course, we've seen plenty of this kind of devastation closer to home, from the Slave Lake wildfire in 2011 to the Beast in Fort McMurray in 2016 to then Lytton in 2021, and then last summer, the flames that consumed much of Jasper, Alberta. But in the case of Jasper, many saw it coming. In fact, it wasn't a matter of if, but when. And the story of how that all happened is being told in a new book. Here to talk about Jasper on Fire, 5 Days of Hell in a Rocky Mountain Paradise, is journalist and author Matthew Scace. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Matt, what went through your mind when the news first broke about the wildfires in LA County? For you, was it a case of, oh no, here we go again?
Uh, yeah, absolutely. Like all of us, we've experienced wildfires in the past several years, especially urban ones, and that's, I guess, an important distinction. Is there are wildfires happening every summer, and in LA County, same thing. They happen pretty frequently, but the ones that touch urban interfaces have become more common. And with Jasper in LA, we seem to be having sort of similar situations. One much greater in devastation, I would say, in terms of just the actual structural loss by the numbers. But yeah, one thing I was really curious about is how similar these fires were. First thing that comes to mind when these things happen is how heartbreaking it is, because the amount of loss that people go through. I think it's actually hard to conceptualize in our minds what like just the sheer amount of the homes, the personal belongings that people lose. And then the second thing is just what triggers these fires and how similar places like Jasper and LA to each other, even though they're in different parts of the world. And so I believe, as far as I've seen so far, is that they're quite similar fires. Different landscapes and different triggers and different types of brush or forest that start these conditions or start these fires. But sort of when you put them over top of each other, they actually do look quite similar.
Now, what made you want to write this book? What was it about the Jasper fire or fires that made them worthy of further study?
Yeah, so I was approached by a publisher, Ken White, right after the fires, and I had been reporting on them a little bit for the Calgary Herald, and he asked if I wanted to write the book, and that's how it all started. But when the opportunity came up, it was an immediate yes for me, because one, I have a fairly strong connection to Jasper. I lived in Prince George for a while, and that's sort of one of the places people go out there. And I think this was one of those events that several people, myself included, will remember where they were when it happened. I remember the night that they had said that the fire was basically on the doorstep of Jasper. And I was somewhat beside myself a bit. It was just really hard to know that Jasper was going to be in some different state when we woke up in the morning, and we didn't know exactly what that would be. I think a lot of people, like myself, imagined that it might just be gone entirely. And so when something like that happens, it's a big historical moment for Canada. I think just telling the story of what happened is a really important thing, because we get these things in news stories, and over the course of months after the fact, we get the autopsy, we get the stories of the people who were there, but they're all sort of disparate and moving around the internet ecosystem now. And I really wanted to put it all together, understand why it happened, what led to this happening, and also just the stories of people who were involved. The mayor, who we all got to know during that process, where the premier of Alberta was the entire time, what was happening in Jasper, so what the firefighters were doing that night. Because if you're following it closely enough, it was a bit of a black box. It was everybody's out of town. We got communications from Parks Canada, but that was effectively it. So I really want to bring that all together and put it into sort of a coherent narrative to understand exactly what happened over those 5 days, basically from Monday to Thursday and Friday, to get the full picture. What were people like? What was it like to evacuate Jasper? What was it like to try to save the town? What was it like coming back for the first time after being away for 2 weeks? So that's kind of what I was trying to do with this book.
Now, there's a lot of talk about prevention and forest management whenever a devastating wildfire happens, especially an urban wildfire. The urge to point fingers, to lay blame. But with Jasper, there are some compelling arguments to be made here. As you write, the town's residents had long known this day would come. It was the result of decades of forest management, the result of natural processes a forest undergoes to regenerate itself, and undoubtedly a result of conditions attributable to a warming climate, but helped along by decades of town planning that had made local homes uniquely accessible to fire. What were some of those preconditions that made Jasper more vulnerable than, say, a Fort McMurray or a Lytton?
I don't know if it would be more predisposed than Fort McMurray and Lytton, but um, basically the long history of Jasper is that it was established as a national park more than 100 years ago. And in that process, indigenous communities were cleared out of the park, and they had understood at the time that fire was a necessary thing to keep the forest regenerating, generating. And so at that time, before generally the federal government and Parks Canada stepped in, fires would happen all the time, but they'd be much smaller, and they would create these pockets of somewhat large fires, but the younger trees would put them out effectively. So they wouldn't be able to expand to this massive fire that we saw in Jasper this summer. But somewhere along the way, fire became viewed as sort of an evil, generally speaking. It's not great for tourism. It's not something people want to see. And you can view it in your own way if you're unfamiliar with fire science as something we just don't need in the landscape. We let the trees grow, blah, blah, blah. But what that did was sort of build this massive forest that has been growing and growing, growing for decades, and made it susceptible to blow up a lot in greater proportions than it used to. So Parks Canada has known this for a while, and they have been working to trim down the forest, do prescribed burns, get things rolling to make sure that the forest is moving in a better direction than it was. But undoing that work is really challenging. Jasper is a massive national park. So that is kind of the main thing that has sort of set us up for this. And then in the moment that we're in right now, where we're having drier, hotter summers, it's just a really nasty combination. So you end up in these situations where the winds, like they were 100 kilometers an hour or more. Some think they were up to 150. It just becomes a bowling ball, and they're really hard to stop.
What was the most frustrating aspect of this to cover? The fact that the building materials that made the homes so susceptible to fires, or the fact that the province couldn't send in water bombers, firefighters, engines, helicopters, or anything else unless Parks Canada asked for it first?
Um, I don't know if it's hard with these situations because you can sort of hindsight's 2020 in wildfires. And when the fire was happening over those 3 days before it came, it was moving really fast, and the conditions were really, really tough. So you can argue that water bombers might have helped, but there were firefighters, or there were folks that were in planes trying to figure out what was happening in the fire, and the wind was so great that they just couldn't even handle it. So there are all these things where, if there could have been an extra 3 planes, it probably would have made a difference. For me, I think it wasn't a frustration, but one of the, I guess, warning signs that we should probably take note of is how we can set up our communities to be resilient in the face of fires like these that are so hard to control and get out of control like this. For decades, when Jasper was becoming a tourist town, it was encouraged that they use certain materials, like cedar shake roofs, which is in the book. And that is a deadly material for wildfires. So I hope that we dig away from these fires. Same thing in California. I saw buildings that looked exactly like those in Jasper, where they have wood sidings or wood roofs. If we can remove those kind of materials from our landscapes that are in the way of fire at times, and we there are lots of different principles, and I won't get into them now because they're a long list of basically fire smarting our homes and making sure our communities are resilient in the face of wildfire. Then I hope we get to a place where we can see less devastation. It's not always preventable from like 100%, but we can get there to at least a closer number than losing, say, a third of a community.
How are those rebuilding efforts going? Are some of those lessons being applied, or are people starting to come back? Will it ever be the same?
Um, yeah, it's a work in progress, I would say. So early on, Parks Canada released new architectural guidelines because they do have very strict rules for how they want people to build their homes in Jasper, because it's a national park and a tourist area. Um, and so they've made very clear in their new architectural guidelines, you cannot have cedar shake, you cannot have flammable materials when you build your home. So that's a step. Um, in terms of the rebuild in general, there are people who have moved back. There are people who probably will never come back because they don't want to go through the process. It's challenging to go through insurance. They just want to maybe take the money if they can get it and go set up somewhere else, because there is a reality that Jasper could experience this again. Um, as for the actual rebuild, that is such an ongoing process that it's hard to say. The province of Alberta, on I believe it was Thursday or Friday, uh, signaled that they would likely be withdrawing their funding for housing. It seems like there's a battle between parks, the town, and the province right now. And to be honest, I don't know what exactly is happening because we've heard the province's side, but we haven't heard the town and Parks Canada. And this is not just Parks Canada, it's also the town of Jasper or municipality. So there's a story to be told there, and I'm not sure I have everything yet, but there is tension right now between the governments and Parks Canada. Because if your listeners may not be familiar, the town of Jasper is inside a national park, which is federal control. So the province doesn't actually have control over that area.
The other thing I thought was interesting as well is that people don't actually own their properties there. They're leased out by the federal government for whatever it is, a 75-year period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. So that I think is what gives them license to sort of say these are the conditions we would allow you to own a home in Jasper. And usually they are. Uh, I, I haven't heard many stories of challenges with building homes to their own designs, but I also, they have their vision, and it's a really fascinating document to read for the architectural guidelines, especially the ones from the 80s and 90s, because they have the ways a corner should look if you own a property that's on the corner of a block, or they want people to have small windows, so they're little windows into the mountains. They're sort of like paintings almost, is what the way they described it. So it's just a fascinating level of control that they do have over the design of homes. So yeah.
Sounds like a giant strata council,
Yeah,
what
in a
they call in
way.
the States an HOA, but
Yeah,
an entire town.
yeah. It's very unique, and there are very few places like that in Canada. I'm pretty sure it's just Banff and Jasper. There could be others, a handful of others, but I'm not sure.
You get into the science of this a little bit as well, and I think we can sort of zoom out a bit into other wildfires. You talk about these so-called fire clouds, the wildfires that are so powerful that they generate their own weather systems. With the effects of climate change becoming more apparent, is this something we can expect to see more of? And terms like pyrocumulonimbus clouds entering our popular lexicon.
Mhm. Yeah, I think so. These things are becoming more common, and the majority of them, according to the research, are happening in Canada because our wildfire seasons have gotten so severe. And these, for folks who don't know, these are basically firestorms that turn into their own weather systems. They create these massive columns of smoke, and you end up with crazy winds that are just unpredictable. And sometimes you get rain inside them. It's just they're a mess, and they're just unbelievably destructive. And there's very little you can do once they've started. So and particularly in Canada, we're not just talking about places far away. It is very isolated to Canada right now. These firestorms seem to be generating more frequently.
When we talk about this notion of urban wildfires, what do you see in common between the Jasper experience and what we've been seeing recently in LA County in Southern California?
Mm-hmm. There are several. So the conditions seemed very similar. We had crazy winds in Jasper, crazy winds in LA, and those seem to be recurring. I think there's more winds expected this week. That's one thing that once the winds get going, the fire's gone. It's really hard to control that. And once it hits homes, it goes house to house to house to house, especially if there are um, pieces of debris that make it more conducive to go from home to home. I said this earlier, but the materials on around the homes, like they're just similarities in what's triggering these urban fires, because there's obviously a difference between urban and wildland fires. And once it enters the urban interface, it's a matter of the materials that are allowing these fires to continue and go from house to house to house. So, from what I've seen from a lot of really good reporting, is that a lot of homes did not have these. I guess we call them safeguards to keep their homes in good shape if a fire approaches them. So the other thing that's, I guess, interesting about these fires is that you end up in the aftermath with homes that are surrounded by other homes that are devastated, basically burned to the ground, and then you have these singular homes that are still standing. And oftentimes you can see why. It's not. Sometimes it's a random occurrence where the wind shifted right as the fire was at its doorstep, and then a lot of times it's because they took measures that were preventing that fire from actually getting triggered and setting their house on fire. The mayor of Jasper had a really interesting experience where his entire home was burned down to the ground, but his shed behind his home, and that one was an anomaly. I don't know if that was fire smart, was still standing. So he still had several of his bikes when he moved back home. So those are kind of the main similarities. I think the measures we take inside our communities will start to matter a lot going forward. And when we see more urban wildfires, I think we'll see the same trends until we change either how building codes work or whether insurance companies are incentivizing people to change their habits around their fire smarting.
What do you hope people take away from this book?
Oh my gosh, there are several things. One, I think there is a bit, and I understand this, a bit of denial around whether your community is actually going to get hit by fire, because it does seem like a bit of a 1 in a million. And the way we looked at wildfire, I think, before Fort McMurray specifically, was that wildfires were happening, but they wouldn't. The likelihood of them hitting our urban interfaces was quite low. But we're seeing it more and more often now. It seems almost commonplace to have at least one event every year, either in the US or Canada, where a wildfire hits a neighborhood or hits an entire town. And I do hope that there is increased awareness of what this experience is like and how devastating it can be, because I don't think we sort of know what it's going to be like until it hits us. But if we can do enough to prepare to hopefully avoid the level of devastation we've experienced in LA or in Jasper, that's kind of what I hope we can get to. And so that the main takeaway being fire smarting homes is kind of a almost a boring answer, because it's not the most glamorous work. It's cleaning up brush around your house, making sure your materials are up to code or fine if an ember hits your roof or something like that. But I really think that's one of the big things, especially for people living in those areas where it's becoming much more realistic that a fire could hit their community.
The name of the book is Jasper on Fire, 5 Days of Hell in a Rocky Mountain Paradise. It's available from Sutherland House. My thanks to author Matthew Scace.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it.